The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 23rd, 1944. Oberst Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz stood in what remained of a Belgian farmhouse, its walls pockmarked with shrapnel, and studied the items laid out on a splintered wooden table before him. An American ration box. Inside it, among the packets of cigarettes, chocolate bars, and coffee, real coffee, sat something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. A small, sealed container labeled ice cream powder, vanilla flavor. His adjutant had found it in a foxhole abandoned by retreating American forces just hours earlier. Von Luttwitz picked up the container, turned it over in his frost-bitten fingers, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the war he was fighting. His men were boiling pine bark to make a thin, bitter soup. The Americans were eating ice cream in their foxholes. This was not supposed to be how the story ended. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the psychological earthquake this discovery represented, we must first understand what German commanders had been told about their enemy, and what they had convinced themselves to believe. The narrative that sustained the Wehrmacht through the brutal years of 1943 and 1944 was not merely propaganda. It was a necessary fiction that allowed rational men to continue fighting a war whose outcome had already been determined by mathematics they refused to calculate. The German High Command had built its entire strategic framework on a fundamental miscalculation about American military capacity. This wasn't ignorance born of lack of information. German intelligence had access to pre-war American industrial statistics. Rather, it was a willful refusal to accept what those numbers meant when translated into military potential. In 1939, the United States produced approximately 4 million automobiles annually. Germany produced less than 300,000. But in the minds of German strategic planners, this disparity didn't matter, because Americans were assumed to lack the martial spirit necessary to convert industrial capacity into military effectiveness. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine, had written in 1937 that the American military was a constabulary force suitable for police actions, but lacking the ideological commitment necessary for sustained high-intensity warfare. This assessment was widely shared among the German officer corps. They had convinced themselves that American wealth was a weakness, that soldiers accustomed to comfort would break when faced with the hardships of real combat. The German soldier, hardened by deprivation and motivated by National Socialist ideology, would prove superior to the soft, materialistic American who fought only because he was paid to do so. This belief system was reinforced by Germany's early war experiences. In Poland, in France, in the Low Countries, German forces had demonstrated that superior training, doctrine, and will could overcome material disadvantages. The French had more tanks than Germany in 1940. They lost anyway. The Soviets had more of everything in 1941. They were pushed back to the gates of Moscow. From these victories, German commanders drew the wrong lesson, that psychological and tactical superiority could indefinitely compensate for industrial inferiority. By late 1944, when von Luttwitz found himself in the Ardennes, the German army was operating on a logistical system that would have seemed impossible to pre-war planners. The Wehrmacht had become an army of scavengers. German soldiers joked bitterly that their supply system consisted of 3 parts: what they could capture, what they could steal, and what they could do without. This wasn't entirely a joke. After the Allied invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, the systematic destruction of French rail infrastructure meant that German units in the West were largely cut off from their rear area supply depots. They survived by improvisation. Von Luttwitz's 2nd Panzer Division had been pulled from the Eastern Front in September of 1944 and refitted, if such a generous word could be applied, for the planned Ardennes offensive. On paper,
The division was at 70% strength. In reality, this number concealed desperate shortages of everything except courage. The division's tank battalion had 58 operational vehicles, a mix of Panther and Panzer IV tanks, but only enough fuel for approximately 150 kilometers of combat operations. After that, the tanks would become pillboxes. The division's supply of spare parts was so limited that maintenance crews had taken to cannibalizing destroyed vehicles, creating hybrid machines held together with wire and ingenuity. But it was the food situation that revealed the true depth of Germany's logistical crisis. The official German army ration in 1944 called for approximately 3,000 calories per day per soldier. This was the amount determined necessary to sustain men engaged in heavy physical labor in winter conditions.
Von Luttwitz's men were receiving, on average, about 1,800 calories daily. The ration consisted primarily of dark bread, increasingly adulterated with sawdust and potato flour to stretch limited grain supplies, a thin soup made from whatever vegetables could be scavenged, and occasionally small amounts of ersatz coffee, a bitter brew made from roasted acorns and barley. Meat was a distant memory. The official meat ration was supposed to be 150 grams daily. Most soldiers hadn't seen meat in weeks. In the days before the Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, German soldiers supplemented their inadequate rations in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. They stripped bark from birch and pine trees, boiling it for hours to create a fibrous, barely digestible paste that at least gave their stomachs something to process. They dug through frozen ground searching for roots. Some units organized hunting parties, though ammunition was too precious to waste on rabbits, so they set snares and checked them obsessively. In von Luttwitz's division, soldiers had taken to trapping crows, roasting them over small fires that had to be carefully hidden from Allied aircraft that controlled the skies. The irony wasn't lost on the German officers who had fought in the East. On the Russian front, Wehrmacht troops had often been better supplied than their Soviet opponents, at least in the early years. German soldiers had looked at Red Army troops with their crude equipment and inadequate clothing, and felt a sense of superiority. Now, facing the Americans, the Germans had become what they had once pitied. Von Luttwitz understood the mathematics of malnutrition. Soldiers operating on 1,800 calories while engaging in winter combat lost weight rapidly. A man who began the offensive at 70 kilograms would lose half a kilogram every 3 days. After 3 weeks of combat, that same soldier would have lost 5 kilograms, weight that came not just from fat reserves, but from muscle tissue the body cannibalized to keep functioning. Malnourished soldiers thought more slowly, reacted more sluggishly, and made more mistakes. They got sick more easily and recovered more slowly when wounded. The German army in the Ardennes was fighting on borrowed time, measured not in ammunition, but in calories. The Ardennes offensive, later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's last gamble in the West. The strategic concept was simultaneously brilliant and insane. German forces would punch through weak American positions in the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies considered too difficult for large-scale operations. The offensive would drive west to Antwerp, splitting Allied armies and capturing the port facilities that supplied them. Denied Antwerp, the Allies would be forced to negotiate. That was the theory. For the plan to work, German forces needed to move fast, covering 120 kilometers in less than a week. They needed to capture American fuel dumps to keep their vehicles moving. They needed surprise, speed, and luck. What they didn't need was for their soldiers to be slowly starving. The offensive began before dawn on December 16th with a massive artillery barrage that stunned American forces along an 80-kilometer front. Von Luttwitz's 2nd Panzer Division was part of the Southern Pincer, assigned to drive west through Luxembourg toward the Meuse River. For the first 48 hours, the plan worked. American units, Many of them inexperienced troops resting in what had been a quiet sector fell back in confusion. German tanks pushed forward through snow and fog that grounded Allied aircraft. By December 18th, von Lüttwitz's spearhead had advanced 30 kilometers. Then they started finding the American positions. The first thing that struck von Lüttwitz's men about abandoned American foxholes wasn't the weapons, though those were impressive enough, but the garbage. In one position that had clearly been occupied by a single squad of perhaps 10 men, German soldiers found the remains of 2 days' worth of American rations. There were empty cans that had contained beef stew, pork and beans, ham and eggs. There were wrappers from chocolate bars, dozens of them, cigarette packages, American brands that German soldiers knew only from pre-war advertisements, and coffee, not ersatz coffee, but real coffee, so much of it that the Americans had apparently thrown away half-full packets. One of von Lüttwitz's company commanders, a veteran who had fought from France to Moscow and back, assembled the trash and conducted an impromptu calculation. Based on the garbage, each American soldier had been consuming approximately 4,000 calories per day. This seemed impossible. That was more than the official German ration for soldiers in heavy combat, and these Americans had been sitting in defensive positions doing relatively little. The company commander brought his findings to von Lüttwitz. The colonel examined the evidence in silence. Then he asked his adjutant to calculate what the German division had available. The mathematics were brutal. Von Lüttwitz's division had approximately 11,000 men. They were currently receiving a total of about 20 million calories per day, 1,800 per man. To bring them up to the American level of 4,000 calories daily would require 44 million calories. The division didn't have that much food in total reserves for a week of combat. The Americans were feeding each soldier more than twice what Germany could provide, and they were doing it as a matter of routine, in defensive positions that were supposed to be quiet sectors. But it was on December 23rd, when the weather cleared and the offensive had definitively stalled, that von Lüttwitz found the ice cream powder. The American foxhole that yielded this discovery had been part of a forward position near Bastogne. The Americans had withdrawn in good order during the night, falling back to tighter defensive lines around the surrounded town. Von Lüttwitz's scouts had occupied the position at first light, expecting to find the usual detritus of hasty retreat, abandoned equipment, empty ammunition boxes, perhaps a few weapons too damaged to carry. Instead, they found an intact position, carefully prepared, with overhead cover against artillery, drainage channels to keep the bottom dry, and a small supply cache the Americans apparently hadn't bothered to take with them. The cache contained 3 cases of sea rations, 2 cases of cigarettes, a box of writing paper and envelopes, several paperback books, and the ice cream powder. There was also a portable stove, fuel tablets, and a small collection of personal items including a baseball and 2 catcher's mitts. Von Lüttwitz tried to process what he was seeing through the lens of his military experience. In every army he knew, soldiers jealously guarded their rations. Food was precious. Men fought over it, hoarded it, never wasted it. These Americans had left behind enough food to feed a German squad for 3 days. They had left behind cigarettes that could be traded for almost anything. They had left behind entertainment, comfort items, things that made life in a foxhole bearable. They had left all of this because carrying it was apparently too much trouble, when they had plenty more where they were going. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ice cream powder crystallized something that had been gnawing at von Lüttwitz's understanding of this campaign. Ice cream required not just calories, but infrastructure. Someone had to manufacture the powder. Someone had to package it. Someone had to ship it across the Atlantic Ocean, where German U-boats were supposedly starving Britain and disrupting Allied supply lines. Someone had to truck it from the ports to forward supply depots. Someone had to distribute it to the units. Someone had to ensure it reached individual soldiers, and then those soldiers had to value it so little
that they would abandon it in a foxhole when they repositioned. This wasn't the profile of an army on the edge of collapse. This was the profile of an army drowning in surplus. Von Luttwitz had been a professional soldier since 1921. He had studied military history, had commanded men in Poland, France, and Russia. He understood logistics, understood the importance of supply lines, understood that modern war was fundamentally about industrial production translated into military power. But understanding something intellectually and confronting its physical manifestation were different experiences. The ice cream powder was physical manifestation. It was proof, tangible and undeniable, that everything the German High Command had told themselves about American military weakness was fantasy. He thought about his own men, many of them teenagers conscripted in the desperate final years of the war, eating soup made from tree bark. He thought about the ersatz coffee they drank, bitter and unsatisfying. He thought about the constant hunger that was now so normal that soldiers only complained when it became acute pain rather than chronic discomfort. And he thought about American soldiers eating ice cream in December in foxholes during active combat operations.
The strategic implications were unavoidable. If the Americans could afford to ship ice cream powder to frontline troops, what couldn't they afford? If they could treat ice cream as a dispensable luxury not worth carrying, what did that say about their total productive capacity? Von Luttwitz had read intelligence reports about American industrial output. He knew the numbers. The Americans were producing 96,000 aircraft per year, 50,000 tanks, 800,000 trucks. But numbers on paper were abstract. Ice cream powder in a Belgian foxhole was concrete. He tried to imagine the German equivalent. He tried to imagine the Führer approving a plan to manufacture ice cream powder for soldiers in the field while German civilians were receiving their sustenance through ration cards that were progressively reduced every month. He tried to imagine the industrial capacity it would take to produce such frivolities, to ship them thousands of kilometers, to distribute them to individual soldiers as routine. He couldn't. Not because German industry lacked the technical capability to make ice cream powder, but because Germany lacked the abundance that would make such a thing conceivable. The weather had cleared on December 23rd, and with clear skies came the Allied aircraft. Von Luttwitz watched from the relative safety of a tree line as wave after wave of American fighter bombers appeared overhead. They came in groups of 4 or 6, circling methodically, hunting for targets. When they found German vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, they descended with a precision that seemed almost leisurely. The pilots knew they faced no opposition. The Luftwaffe was absent, had been absent for days, would remain absent. The Americans owned the sky so completely that they could afford to take their time, making multiple passes to ensure each target was thoroughly destroyed. Von Luttwitz counted 12 separate airstrikes in a 3-hour period, each one lasting 15 to 20 minutes. The mathematical implications were staggering. Each fighter bomber represented thousands of hours of labor to manufacture, thousands of liters of fuel to operate, hundreds of kilograms of ammunition and rockets to arm. The Americans were expending this vast investment of resources against targets that, in the grand scheme of the war, were tactically insignificant. A single supply truck, a damaged tank that might have been repaired, a few soldiers caught in the open. The Americans could afford to be wasteful because they had so much to waste. One of his younger officers, a lieutenant who had received his commission only 3 months earlier, asked the question that von Luttwitz had been avoiding. "Sir, if they can do this here everywhere they're fighting, all along the front, how long have we actually had?" The lieutenant's voice trailed off, not from fear but from the sheer weight of the realization settling over him. Von Luttwitz didn't answer immediately. How could he? The honest answer was that Germany had lost the war in December of 1941, when Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Everything since then had been a slow-motion collapse disguised by tactical victories that meant nothing strategically. But you couldn't say that to a lieutenant whose job was to lead men into combat, men who might die tomorrow or the next day in service of a cause that was already lost. Instead, von Lüttwitz said, "We fight because we are soldiers. The politicians decided this war. We execute their decisions." It was the answer of a professional military man, technically correct and morally empty. The lieutenant nodded and went back to his duties, but von Lüttwitz could see that the young man understood what hadn't been said. The contrast between German and American logistics wasn't a secret to the soldiers on the ground. They could see it every day in a dozen different ways. When German soldiers were wounded, they were evacuated, if they were lucky, in horse-drawn carts or trucks that might or might not have fuel. American wounded were evacuated in ambulances that seemed to materialize within minutes, equipped with medical supplies, staffed by trained medics, backed by field hospitals that could perform complex surgeries. German soldiers wrapped their wounds in bandages that had often been used before, washed and reused because new bandages were scarce. American soldiers had individual first aid kits containing morphine, sulfur powder, bandages, and antiseptic. Enough supplies that German soldiers specifically targeted American medics not to harm them, but to capture their medical bags. The ammunition situation told the same story. Von Lüttwitz's artillery batteries had been rationed to 15 shells per gun per day since the offensive began. This meant artillery commanders had to choose their targets with agonizing care. Every shell fired was one less shell available for tomorrow, and there was no guarantee that tomorrow's supply convoy would arrive. American artillery, by contrast, seemed to operate under no constraints whatsoever. When American batteries opened fire, they fired for effect. Dozens of shells, sometimes hundreds, turning target areas into moonscapes. Von Lüttwitz had watched American artillery preparation fires that expended more ammunition in 30 minutes than his entire division's artillery had available for a week. The fuel crisis was perhaps most acute. Von Lüttwitz's tank battalion had begun the offensive with enough fuel for approximately 150 kilometers of movement. By December 23rd, most vehicles were down to their last reserves. The plan had been to capture American fuel dumps, and in the first days of the offensive, some German units succeeded in doing exactly that. But the quantities captured, while helpful, weren't enough. One American fuel dump might contain enough gasoline to keep a German division moving for 2 or 3 days. Then what? The fundamental problem wasn't that Germany couldn't capture fuel. It was that Germany couldn't produce enough fuel to sustain mobile operations. The Romanian oil fields that had supplied much of Germany's petroleum had been lost to the Soviets in August of 1944. The synthetic fuel plants that were supposed to make up the shortfall were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Meanwhile, the Americans operated as if fuel was infinite. Their tanks didn't maneuver cautiously to conserve gas. Their trucks made multiple trips daily. Their aircraft flew constantly. Von Lüttwitz had captured documents from an American supply company that showed fuel allocation. The numbers seemed absurd. An American armored division received approximately 150,000 liters of fuel per day during active operations. Von Lüttwitz's entire panzer division would have needed to capture 10 such American fuel dumps to maintain operations for a single week. But it was the small details, the trivial things, that really drove home the disparity. American soldiers had toilet paper. This seemed like a joke, until you realized that German soldiers had been using newspaper, leaves, or whatever else was available for months. American soldiers had soap, real soap, not the harsh ersatz soap that German troops received irregularly. American soldiers changed their socks, a basic infantry hygiene practice that prevented trench foot. They could afford to change socks because they had spare socks. German soldiers wore the same socks until they rotted off their feet. Von Lüttwitz had found a letter in one of the abandoned American positions, written by a private to his family back home. The private complained about the food. He was tired of sea rations, he wrote. He wanted a home-cooked meal, a steak, fresh vegetables. Von Lüttwitz read this letter and felt something close to despair. This American soldier was complaining about having to eat 4,000 calories of preserved food daily. He was complaining about conditions that would have seemed like paradise to von Lüttwitz's men. The cultural implications were as significant as the material ones. The letter revealed that American soldiers expected comfort. They expected regular mail service. The letter included a complaint that mail was running 2 weeks late. They expected hot showers, which apparently American units provided regularly. They expected entertainment. The soldier mentioned watching movies, actual films projected on screens, in rear areas. They expected all of this as their due, as the baseline standard for military service. German soldiers expected hardship. They expected to be cold, hungry, and tired. They expected to go weeks without bathing. They expected mail to arrive irregularly, if at all. The contrast wasn't just about wealth. It was about two fundamentally different conceptions of what an army was and how it should treat its soldiers. The American approach was industrial. Soldiers were valuable assets that needed to be maintained at peak efficiency. The German approach was increasingly feudal. Soldiers were expected to endure through willpower and ideological commitment. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, von Lüttwitz's division had been ordered to pull back. The offensive had failed. Bastogne hadn't fallen. American reinforcements were arriving faster than German units could be supplied. The weather had cleared, and Allied air superiority was now making daylight movement suicidal. The division began its withdrawal, a process complicated by lack of fuel, mechanical breakdowns, and constant air attacks. Von Lüttwitz watched his men during the withdrawal and saw the psychological toll that went beyond physical exhaustion. These were soldiers who had been told they were superior. They had been told that German training, German tactics, German will were superior to anything the Allies could field. They had been told that Americans were soft, that they would break under pressure, that one German soldier was worth 3 Americans. And then they had met the Americans and discovered that none of it was true. The Americans weren't better soldiers in the sense of individual fighting skill. German tactical training was probably still superior. German small unit leadership was excellent. German soldiers fought with remarkable tenacity even in defeat. But none of that mattered when the other side had 3 times as many soldiers, 10 times as many tanks, complete control of the air, and unlimited supplies. Quality couldn't compensate for quantity when the quantity differential was so vast. That was the lesson of the ice cream powder. That was the truth von Lüttwitz's men were beginning to understand. On December 25th, Christmas Day, von Lüttwitz's division received a special meal. It wasn't much. Some additional bread, a small amount of meat that might have been pork, some vegetables. It was supposed to be a morale boost, a reminder of home, of what they were fighting for. The men ate it mechanically, without joy. Von Lüttwitz ate with his officers in the ruins of a Belgian farmhouse. Someone had found a small pine tree and decorated it with spent bullet casings. It was a pathetic attempt at normalcy, at maintaining the traditions that defined them as civilized men. They sang Silent Night, because that's what German soldiers did on Christmas. Their voices were thin and tired. Von Lüttwitz wondered what the Americans were eating for Christmas. He didn't have to wonder long. 2 days later, his scouts captured an American supply truck that had become separated from its convoy. The truck was being evacuated because it had mechanical problems, a minor issue that would normally take an hour to repair, but the Americans had apparently decided it was easier to abandon the truck and its cargo than to delay the convoy. The cargo included Christmas rations that had been prepared for American troops. There was turkey, actual turkey, canned but recognizable. There were cranberries. There was pumpkin pie filling. There were bottles of Coca-Cola. Von Lüttwitz ordered the supplies distributed to his men. He watched them eat American Christmas dinner and saw expressions he hadn't seen in months. Not joy exactly, but something like wonder. For a few hours his soldiers ate like the enemy ate, and they understood viscerally what they were fighting against. They weren't fighting the American military. They were fighting American industrial capacity. They were fighting an economy that could afford to ship cranberry sauce to Belgium, that could manufacture specialized Christmas rations for soldiers in the field, that could treat turkey dinner as a baseline expectation rather than an impossible luxury. The Wehrmacht's official after-action reports on the Ardennes offensive focused on tactical and operational failures. They noted that fuel shortages had prevented the armored spearheads from reaching their objectives. They noted that American resistance had been more determined than expected. They noted that clearing weather had allowed Allied air power to intervene decisively. These were all true, but they were symptoms rather than causes. The real failure was strategic, and it had been determined long before the first German soldier crossed into Belgium. Germany had entered a war of industrial production against enemies, Britain, the Soviet Union, and especially the United States, whose combined industrial capacity dwarfed German capabilities. In 1944, the United States alone produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American shipyards launched a new merchant vessel every day. American factories produced one aircraft every 5 minutes. These weren't estimates or propaganda figures. They were documented facts that German intelligence knew and German leadership refused to accept. The psychology of denial that had sustained the German war effort was breaking down in the winter of 1944 to 1945. Officers like von Luttwitz, professional military men who had been trained to assess situations objectively, could no longer ignore the evidence in front of them. The ice cream powder was a small thing, trivial in isolation, but it was part of a pattern so overwhelming that only willful blindness could miss it. Von Luttwitz kept the ice cream powder. He never used it. By the time he might have had the means to prepare it, he had been captured by American forces during the final German collapse in March of 1945. He kept it as a talisman, a physical reminder of the moment he understood the truth. Later, in prisoner of war camps, he would tell other German officers about finding the ice cream powder, and they would share similar stories. One had found American soldiers' letters complaining about not having access to fresh milk. Another had captured American rations that included chewing gum, not 1 pack, but 12 packs per soldier. A third had discovered that American tank crews carried portable phonographs and records, music to listen to between battles. These stories circulated among German prisoners not as entertainment, but as a form of collective therapy. They were trying to understand how they had lost. The official Nazi explanation, betrayal by Jews, communists, and defeatists on the home front, was revealed as nonsense when you confronted the material evidence. Germany hadn't lost because of betrayal. Germany had lost because it had picked a fight with countries whose total economic output was approximately 10 times greater than its own. No amount of tactical brilliance, no degree of ideological commitment could overcome that differential. After the war, historians would analyze the Ardennes offensive as Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Western Allies and force a negotiated peace. They would note that the offensive was based on faulty assumptions about Allied responses, inadequate logistics, and unrealistic objectives. All of this was true. But for the soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, the offensive revealed something simpler and more profound. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to give its soldiers ice cream in Foxholes, while German soldiers ate tree bark. Von Luttwitz survived the war. He was released from prisoner of war status in 1947 and returned to Germany, which was now divided and occupied. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences in any detail. Like many professional German officers of his generation, he maintained a careful silence about the Nazi period, focusing instead on rebuilding his life in a country that had been comprehensively destroyed. But in private, among other veterans, he would occasionally tell the story of the ice cream powder. The story always ended the same way. Someone would ask, "When did you know Germany had lost the war?" And von Lüttwitz would describe the morning of December 23rd, 1944, standing in a ruined Belgian farmhouse, holding a container of American ice cream powder while his men boiled tree bark for soup. "That's when I knew," he would say. Not because of the ice cream itself, but because of what it represented. We were fighting a nation that could afford to treat ice cream as a disposable commodity. We couldn't afford to feed our soldiers adequately. The war was over. We just didn't know how to stop fighting. The ice cream powder story might seem like a minor anecdote, a curious footnote to the larger narrative of World War II. But it captures something essential about modern warfare that the German military leadership failed to understand until it was too late. Wars between industrialized nations are fundamentally wars of production. Tactics matter. Leadership matters. Courage matters. But when one side can produce 10 times as much of everything, food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, those traditional military virtues become insufficient. The German army in World War II was arguably the most tactically proficient military force of its era. German officers were superbly trained. German small unit tactics were innovative and effective. German soldiers fought with remarkable determination even in hopeless situations. But Germany lost because tactics couldn't overcome logistics, and logistics couldn't overcome the brutal mathematics of industrial capacity. The Americans could afford to make mistakes because they could afford to try again with fresh troops and new equipment. The Germans couldn't afford mistakes because they had no reserves, no replacement equipment, no strategic depth. The story of von Lüttwitz and the ice cream powder is ultimately a story about the delusions that sustain losing efforts. The German military leadership convinced themselves that will and spirit could triumph over material disadvantage. They convinced themselves that American soldiers, raised in comfort, would prove inferior to German soldiers hardened by deprivation. They convinced themselves, against all evidence, that Germany could win a war of attrition against enemies with vastly greater resources. These delusions weren't unique to Germany. Throughout history, nations have convinced themselves that their special virtues, superior courage, better training, racial advantages, ideological commitment, would overcome material disadvantages. Sometimes, in limited contexts, these factors do matter. But in total war between industrial powers, material capacity becomes determinative. The side that can produce more, ship more, supply more, and waste more will prevail if the war continues long enough. For the German soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, the ice cream powder and similar discoveries marked the end of their ideological innocence. They had been raised in a propaganda environment that taught German superiority in all things. They had been told that enemies, Americans, British, Russians, were inferior in capability and will. And then they met these enemies and discovered that the propaganda was lies. The Americans weren't inferior, they were different. They approached war as an industrial problem to be solved through overwhelming application of resources. This approach wasn't elegant or particularly martial in the traditional sense. It was effective. The personal cost of this realization varied among German soldiers. Some, like von Lüttwitz, simply acknowledged reality and did their duty until the war ended. Others felt betrayed by their leadership, by the promises that had proven empty. Still others retreated into denial, insisting that Germany would have won if only they had more time, better leadership, one more offensive. But for thoughtful observers, the ice cream powder and its equivalents made clear that the outcome had never been in doubt once the United States entered the war with its full industrial capacity. In the decades after the war, the story of German soldiers eating tree bark while American soldiers had ice cream became part of the informal oral history of World War II veterans. It appeared in memoirs, in interviews, in the kind of conversations that veterans have among themselves. The story resonated because it captured in a single image the vast gulf between the two sides' material conditions. You didn't need to understand complex industrial statistics or logistical planning to understand that gulf. You just needed to know that one side had ice cream and the other had tree bark. The lessons of this disparity remain relevant. Modern military planning emphasizes logistics, supply chains, and industrial capacity precisely because the World War II experience demonstrated their decisive importance. The United States military, in particular, built its post-war doctrine around the concept of overwhelming material superiority. The goal was never again to be in a position where American soldiers lacked anything they needed while enemies had abundance. This doctrine has its critics. It can lead to wasteful practices and a dependence on complex supply chains, but it reflects a hard lesson learned in conflicts like the Ardennes offensive. For von Lüttwitz, the ice cream powder remained a personal symbol of a larger failure. Not his personal failure. He had performed his duties competently in an impossible situation, but the failure of a system that had promised victory and delivered only destruction. He had been a career military officer who believed in service, duty, and professional excellence. He had done his job as well as possible under the circumstances, and none of it had mattered because the circumstances were determined by factors beyond any individual's control. The final accounting of the Ardennes offensive showed approximately 89,000 American casualties and approximately 67,000 German casualties. The Americans replaced their losses within weeks. The Germans couldn't replace theirs at all. By January of 1945, the Wehrmacht was drafting 16-year-old boys and men in their 50s. By March, organized resistance in the West had effectively collapsed. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945 with German unconditional surrender. Von Lüttwitz's division, which had begun the war with 11,000 men, ended it with fewer than 2,000 combat-effective soldiers. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or simply dispersed into the chaos of total defeat. The tanks were gone, destroyed by air attack or abandoned for lack of fuel. The artillery was silent, the guns destroyed or captured. The supply system had ceased to exist. In the final days, German soldiers fought with whatever they could find, scavenging ammunition from the dead, eating whatever they could locate, retreating toward a homeland that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. And through it all, through the collapse and the surrender and the occupation that followed, some veterans like von Lüttwitz carried with them the memory of that December morning in Belgium. The snow falling, the ruined farmhouse, the American ration box with its impossible abundance, the ice cream powder that represented everything they had failed to understand about the war they were fighting. It was a small thing, easily dismissed as a curiosity, but for those who understood its significance, it was the moment when the lies fell away and reality could no longer be denied. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.